Good afternoon and welcome everyone to FBI-LEEDA's second of the April webinar series. Today, April 16th, 2020, we have Quentin Williams, founder and CEO of Dedication to Community, who will be speaking with Dr. Neil Moore. Today's session will be recorded as well as streamed live on Facebook and YouTube. This will also be recorded and posted to FBI-LEEDA.org for future viewing. At the conclusion of this webinar, we will be sending a certificate of participation to all those who were on the webinar. For any questions at the end, feel free to reach out to us at info@FBI-LEEDA.org.
Hi, my name is Neil Moore. I'm the Director of Curriculum and Instruction at FBI-LEEDA. And welcome to our second in the April series webinars. And it is my pleasure to introduce our guest here in just a few minutes. FBI-LEEDA is dedicated, as you know, to the advancement of law enforcement leadership throughout the United States. For those of you that are joining us for the second webinar, welcome. Glad to have you back. For those who are new, we welcome you as well and hope that you'll continue to watch through the remainder of April and most of May as we continue our webinar series. Our speaker today is a very exciting person for me to introduce simply because of the topic matter, if nothing else. Quentin Williams is an attorney, he's an author, he's a prolific international speaker, a former FBI agent, a former federal prosecutor. I don't know when he has time to sleep. He currently serves as an industry advisor, a business strategist, a crisis management consultant, and a legal expert with a wealth of knowledge and experience in wide-ranging areas of business, including the sports and entertainment industries. He also had executive experience with the National Football League and the National Basketball Association as well. He's very much an in-demand keynote speaker, and he has addressed business and education and community leaders at conferences and symposia throughout the world, including some very prominent lectures at Harvard University, the FBI Academy, AXA Corporate, the United States Department of Justice, and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and Drivers Education National Association. He has also written a book that I find very interesting. He and I were doing background, Survival Guide, how to stop from being killed by the police. And believe it or not, extremely positive book that police departments throughout the United States are using to start bridging community relations gaps and helping improve relationships with communities. So very interesting speaker. And today we're going to talk about bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community during a crisis. And Quentin, it is on behalf of FBI-LEEDA and myself, just a pleasure to have you with us, and welcome to the show.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Neil. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
So I think I'd like to just start by, again, saying thank you for having me here, and to talk about some of the most pressing issues of today. We are confronted, of course, with the COVID-19 crisis, but when that clears up, we are still going to be confronted with some of the issues of society that we had prior to COVID-19. And so it's important for us not to get our eyes off the ball when it comes to these issues, and to use this time that we have now, this time of reflection, to look at strategies for how we're going to handle those issues. And I'm speaking primarily about the issues of division that we've seen come to the surface over the last 5 to 10 years between law enforcement and the communities they serve. And when I have the honor of teaching law enforcement officers, one of the primary questions without fail that I am asked is, and this happens every time I'm in front of an audience, I'm asked the question, how do we get our communities to love us again? It's a profound question. And what in essence I'm being asked is, how do we get our communities to trust us again? How do we get our communities to heal from this divide that we've had for so long? And how do we get to reconciliation? And reconciliation is a big word for many of us. But in essence, it means, how do we bring everyone together? And that's what I'd like to talk about today. And I'm interested in having a discussion with you, Neil, because you're an expert and you've been a chief. You've been a chief, and you've been a chief during some extremely erratic times during the crack epidemic. I remember it well. And I know you have your own stories that we can get into as well about those times and being a leader during those times. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to having that conversation.
Yeah. Can you start us off, Quentin? I mean, can we talk your thoughts on reconciliation? Is that our starting point, or would you rather give us any other details?
That is the starting point. So the question of how do we get our communities to love us again, it inspires a response from me that is that deals with reconciliation and the steps that we must take to get to reconciliation. And we teach this across the nation. We teach it at the FBI National Academy, and very fortunate to have the opportunity to teach a course at the FBI National Academy with my co-instructor, Matt Rebuck, who's an FBI agent. We teach the 8 steps to reconciliation. We call it the recipe for reconciliation. It's an 8, and these are the 8 ingredients for that recipe. And the first recipe is, well, let's just start off with this. Have you ever been in a conversation with somebody and judging by their body language, that they're just waiting to talk?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
They're not really listening. They're talking. They're waiting to talk, and they're waiting to respond. And that's what is the impetus for their silence, is the anticipation for them to respond. Well, that drives home the point for us. The first step to reconciliation is to listen. And not just to listen, but to listen beautifully. So the difference between listening and listening beautifully is, when you listen beautifully, you are listening to truly learn, to truly understand what the person speaking is attempting to convey. And that is our first step in the recipe for reconciliation. We have to be intentional. We have to be deliberate with how we listen, because that is a powerful tool for learning and understanding. And in this context, learning and understanding what the community is desirous of having. So first ingredient is listening, and listening beautifully. And you're going to, all the folks who are tuned in here are going to have a PowerPoint presentation, which is only a few sheets long. One of those sheets has the 8 ingredients for the recipe for reconciliation. So listening beautifully. And we listen to learn. Learning is the second ingredient. Learning then leads to understanding. Understanding is the third ingredient. I was at a panel discussion several years ago with an executive from the police department in that jurisdiction. And we had this incredible panel discussion for about 2 hours. It was a town hall discussion, packed house. Afterward, he comes up to me, he says, "This was wonderful, it was great. We talked a lot about a lot of things." But he said, "You know what? We need to come to grips with the fact that until we acknowledge where we have come from and how we are now calibrated, we're not going to be able to move to that healing phase. And I asked him what he meant by it. And he said, you know, we have to acknowledge as an industry, this was a senior executive with a law enforcement agency. He said, we have to acknowledge that we come from a storied past. Law enforcement community's relationship has a storied past. And the community in many cases just wants us to acknowledge that. They want us to acknowledge our history. And if we acknowledge it, then we can move on with them and we would be able to heal. But without that, we're not going to be able to. And I did a lot of research, and he's right. Acknowledgement is our fourth ingredient. We need to acknowledge that history because that's what our community wants us to do. They want us to acknowledge it so that we can heal from that point on. So listening, learning, understanding, the fourth ingredient is acknowledgement.
Quentin, let me ask you a question right there. You know, police chiefs and sheriffs are probably pretty good at that, but how do we make sure that the line officer understands the context of this history, the things that have come before, perhaps even that young police officer's time wearing a badge? Are those important things for us to acknowledge and understand, especially at the line level?
Oh, most definitely, because they're boots on the ground. They're the ones who are interacting on a daily basis with the community. And if the community is feeling one way and those on the street are not aware of why they're feeling that way, there's going to be a chasm. And it's one that will not be bridged if those on the street aren't educated to know about those issues. So yes, most definitely, everybody. And it's not just sworn officers. All personnel at agencies need to know. Support staff, everybody has got to understand the history, because what we have here with this recipe for reconciliation is we have a recipe to change culture. And that culture can only be changed if it's an all-in proposition. If everybody is a part of this culture shift. If we only have sworn officers who are educated and aware, but their support staff isn't, there's still going to be a divide.
Okay.
So that's very important. Great question. Great question. So that's the fourth ingredient is acknowledgement. And then we get to the meat of this recipe. We get to action. What is the action that needs to be taken? It's so funny because every time I go in front of an audience of law enforcement officers and they're taking a class that they know involves law enforcement community relations, they immediately think that the class is going to be about programs. Which programs do we run that have been historically successful that we can implement at our agency and just solve this crisis? And really, if you look at the programs are just the mechanism to build the relationship. They're just tools. And some people might think they're just superficial tools. The real action that is needed is the building of genuine relationships. So how do you show up at those barbecues and pizza parties and barbershops? How do you show up as a law enforcement officer? If you show up and stand on the wall and don't talk to anybody, then what good is the tool, the mechanism? But if you show up with vulnerability, courage, expressing your purpose, understanding the pain, that the community and the agency is feeling because of this divide. Now we have real action because you're showing up and creating relationships. A lot of people, so the action that we speak of, and we teach this at the Academy, the National Academy, and we teach this at agencies across the nation, the action we speak of is vulnerability, courage, purpose, power, the efficient use of power, and pain, the understanding of pain. Whatever that pain might be from the community, whatever that pain might be from one's own agency. That's the true action, because that's how the relationship will be built. And a lot of law enforcement officers believe that the first one I mentioned, vulnerability, is something that they will never, ever express in the presence of those whom they serve, because it shows weakness. However, we vehemently believe that vulnerability is a strength, not a weakness. And when you express to your community, perhaps by sharing a little bit of your story, that you are just like them. They are not them. They are we. They are us. There's connectivity all of a sudden. Now the community starts to see that law enforcement officers aren't the robotic things that they believe them to be. They're actually human beings. You know, a lot of people who I've spoken to in the community, they don't even consider that law enforcement officers have families, that they coach their kids, they do homework with their kids, that they go on vacations. They don't see them in that way. They see them as robots. They don't see them out of the uniform, without the badge. They don't. It's just something, because it's been embedded in some of our communities. So when it's shared with them that these are the circumstances under which law enforcement officers live, that they're the same circumstances that the community members live under, now we're talking about something that will bridge the gap, will create that connectivity. So that action is very important. We spend a lot of time on vulnerability, courage, the courage to take steps in calculated ways, to do things that might not ordinarily be acceptable or historically be acceptable, might be a little different. And when I speak of courage, I think of your story that you told me, Neil, and I'd like for you to share that as well. Courage, purpose. This is beyond making money, obviously. We strapped up our vest every time we strapped it up, knowing that it could be the last time. And we're not making millions of dollars doing it. There's a bigger, a greater purpose to this. Purpose, power, the efficient use of power. That seat that officers sit in, by having that badge on them, gives them great authority, great power. It gives them great power in that they can also call upon folks in the community to do things that will help the community. Police officers will get their phone calls returned because they sit in that seat. And then pain, the pain that a community might be feeling, to have empathy for that pain, and to express the pain that officers might be going through so that communities can feel the same empathy towards them. That's action.
Okay, very good.
And then we move up the spectrum from action. That action engenders trust. We often get the question, how do we build trust? Well, there's the recipe. You listen, you learn, you understand, you acknowledge, you take action as we expressed it, with vulnerability, courage, purpose, power, and pain. And you apply those to whatever programs you have. And then you'll see that organically, trust will be served. Trust will be built, will be constructed. A lot of times what we try to do is we try to force trust. on folks. Trust is earned.
Yeah.
And by taking the action that we believe is best, that we outlined, that's how you build trust organically. That's how it's earned.
Yeah.
And that trust then leads to healing. And then that healing leads to reconciliation. So those are the 8 ingredients.
Quentin, we
Sorry.
actually have a question coming in and also a comment. Someone said, this is so true. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the community members say, who know me well, I don't recognize you out of uniform. Another member here said, due to COVID-19 concerns, many departments are mandating the wearing of masks while interacting with the public. How could this negatively affect community relations, and how can departments overcome the barrier?
Oh, what a great question. What a great question. So we have a challenge, and thank you for the comment, the first comment that you read, Laura. For going to the second question, it's a challenge. I believe it's a temporary challenge. Now, it might change the way we interact over the long term in some way. But I do believe we're going to be back, ultimately, we're going to be back to not having masks on. But in the interim, as we do have these masks, I believe that, and many have told me this throughout my life, my 54 years, that the pathway to one's soul is their eyes. So we are able to still look each other in the eye. We do have restrictions, but we're able to look each other in the eye. And we're able to communicate and say things that will build that trust. It's a challenge. It's a challenge that we're all going through. So this is not just happening in one region. So we're all used to what we are up against here. But this is going to reinforce just how important the communication link is between law enforcement and community. The way we communicate with our speech, the way we communicate with our eyes, the way we communicate with our actions. And social media is going to play a huge role, because social media gives us a chance to connect, just like it gives everybody a chance in the world to connect all the time. So how are we messaging as agencies? How are we messaging to our community? Are we silent, or are we continuing to give them information? I think this is a chance, because crisis brings opportunity. I think this is a chance for law enforcement agencies to communicate at a higher level with their communities by continuing to provide them with positive information and educational information through social media. Give them updates, constantly give them updates, give them positive information about what the agency is doing, where the agency is working, some of the programs you have in place. One of my buddies who is with the Yonkers Police Department, he posts on social media a lot about some of the things that the Yonkers Police Department is doing, and the way they're, and this is something that everybody in the nation is doing in the law enforcement industry, the way that the law enforcement industry is thanking the first responders in hospitals. It is so touching to see how agencies are coming together outside of hospitals and basically holding a parade, keeping in mind social distancing, holding a parade for the hospital workers. I mean, it's such a touching thing to see on social media. These are the things that we can do in this challenging time. Does that answer the question, Laura?
I think it absolutely does, and then some. Thank you so much, Quentin.
Sure.
I had an experience.
Neil, go ahead, Neil.
Well, I was going to tell you, I had an experience in Fort Worth, Texas, when I was doing my dissertation research, and I was assigned to a neighborhood police officer in their model of community policing. And this young man was in his third year of doing the work, and he was assigned to 2 neighborhoods in Fort Worth. And he told an interesting story that I think confirms a couple of things you're saying. He was dispatched in his beat area to a park area in a predominantly African-American part of Fort Worth, Texas, and it was a shooting. And he was the first person on the scene, and he's administering first aid, and a small crowd had gathered. The EMS unit gets there, they administer first aid, they take the victim to the hospital, and he turned, this was his first year, and he turned to the crowd and said, "Who saw this?" And the way he tells the story, the crowd turned without saying a word and walked away from him. Now we advanced 3 years down the road. Now he's in his third year, same park, similar shooting, and we're repeating the facts of that first year shooting. Small crowd develops. When he gets done administering first aid, he turns to the crowd and said, "Who saw something?" And all of a sudden he has 3 people that are kind of hanging around to talk with him after the EMS unit has cleared the scene. So what's your take, Quentin? I mean, well, what's this officer doing that we all should be doing?
Well, he's my guess, because I don't know the officer, but I can make an educated guess here that officer in those 3 years built relationships in that community that were of substance by doing what we talked about with that action, not by throwing pizza parties and stuff like that, but by coming to the neighborhoods, being in that community with vulnerability, courage, purpose, power, pain. That's the result. The result is now that there are people who trust the officer, and that trust is so vital if we're talking about reconciliation. So here's something that I often say. A lot of people say, well, why do we have to build these relationships between law enforcement and community? And if you just take out the moral reasons for it, because it's the right thing to do, just take that out of the equation. And there are 3 very important reasons to build these relationships. If it's just for business, just for the professional piece of this, there are 3 really important reasons that will benefit law enforcement officers and agencies. The first one is what you just talked about, the intelligence gathering. We have rock stars in our law enforcement agencies all across the world. Those rock stars are the ones who know that something's going to happen before it happens. That is so valuable. It's much more valuable, if you think about it, to know that somebody is attempting to blow up the George Washington Bridge before it happens than after. It's a game changer to have that information. Yeah. So for intelligence reasons alone, if these relationships are built, you can find out that something's going to happen before it happens and stop it from happening. You don't have to put up the yellow tape. Extremely important. The second reason is for officer safety. Those 3 people who hung around for that officer in Fort Worth, if there was a safety issue that had to do with that officer, somebody may have wanted to do that officer harm, there's a chance that one of those 3 people may have told that officer beforehand. Safety, that's the second reason. Okay. And the third reason is, we have every other day, statistics say we have an officer taking their own life. 1 out of every 2 days. It's a number that is just beyond comprehension if you think about it. Yeah. The stresses of being a law enforcement officer are so deep. If you're not one or haven't been one, you might not understand just how deep these stresses are. Well, think about the stresses of going into a community every day knowing that they don't like you, knowing that there is that tension. What happens? you hold that tension in your shoulders, day in, day out, the weight of it. You bring it home with you. Your family sees it. Some become introverted as a result. Some express it explicitly as a result. It makes for a stressful situation, and it all goes to wellness. Officer wellness is deeply impacted by the stressors of everyday law enforcement work. And if that everyday law enforcement work has stressors involving community, and we're able to alleviate ourselves of those stressors, take some of that weight off of our shoulders, it helps with our well-being. It helps with our wellness. It helps with our quality of life and the number of years we live. So when we talk about why, taking moral reasons out of this, we talk about intelligence gathering, safety, and wellness. Three very good reasons. If you don't have any other reasons for building these relationships, those are three great reasons that benefit the officers and the agents.
I really agree with that, Quentin. I agree a lot. Laura, I think we're kind of a natural pause here. Do you want to run your poll at this point?
I would love to run the poll. First, we have two questions, though, that are somewhat relatable. So I'd love to see if we can answer those.
All right.
Sure.
So the first one would be from a Christopher George. He said, with many departments short-staffed and running from call to call, how do you best recommend establishing quality relationships between line level officers and the community?
That's a great question. And that's a big issue because many, if not most, agencies do have a shortfall when it comes to personnel. So making sure that, and you are running from call to call, making sure that the limited amount of time you have, you're using those 5 pieces, or as many of those 5 pieces in the action portion that I spoke to when communicating with folks in the community. So vulnerability, courage, purpose, power, pain. Whatever you have to do to establish any or all of those in that moment. And you might only have 30 seconds, you might only have 5 minutes. But if you can establish empathy, and it's sometimes just done through eyes and simple communication, that'll go a long way. And then when you give your card out, that you follow up with them as well as offer for them to follow up with you. So that maybe when you have some downtime, you can ride by that neighborhood and find that person and have a longer conversation with them. This is another reason, though, your question brings up the other reason why this relationship between law enforcement and community is so important. Because what you want to do is, at some point, ultimately, you want the community to watch over themselves. We are not necessarily going to get back to the staffing that we once had in America. It's going to take a while. It's not going to happen over the next year or 5 years. It's going to take a long time to get personnel at that level, if it does get back to that level. But the solution is to ensure that we build relationships with our community so that the community can take the burden off of law enforcement. I always said that 75% of law enforcement work should be done by the communities themselves, not by law enforcement, because we've polled our audiences in between, and for the most part, they say between 80 to 90% of the calls that law enforcement gets are not even criminal law enforcement related. They're more social issues. So if we can use the seat that we sit in as law enforcement officers to get the community to embrace watching over themselves in a legal way, and get those who are experts and leaders in the community to advocate for that, we won't have to get back to the staffing requirements we had in the past. So it was a great question. It brought up that issue. I'm glad you asked it. And then you have a second question, Laura?
I do. This one is from Juan Jerry. They had asked, how do we get our agencies to get the buy-in and instill within the whole department not only what is in the mission statement, but gaining rapport within the community?
So that mission statement is really important. And I have a co-instructor, Tom Gillen, who often, when I teach with him, he often pulls up the mission statement for the agency where we're teaching, and he asks everybody to raise their hands if they know that mission statement by heart, and then he takes the mission statement down. And many don't. They just don't. And that, I think, has to be the first step. Everybody in that agency must know the mission statement by heart. Because how are you going to communicate that mission statement to the community and get the buy-in from the community if you don't know it yourself? So step one, know it by heart. The mission statement, too, should also be short enough to be understandable. It shouldn't be complicated. So some agencies, we've tried to guide some agencies to rewrite their mission statement so that it's simple and understandable by the personnel, support and sworn, and by the community. And once you have a simple mission statement that everybody in the agency knows by heart, now you can go to the community, and as a part of what you're teaching, you can teach the community about your mission statement and why it's important, why it was developed, and what it means. And I think that's going to get you a long way there. Thank you for that question.
Of course. Now, I think it would be a great time to get into one of our two polls. So the first poll that we're going to launch asks, have you had exposure to community relations training as part of an in-service training? Our attendees can answer yes, no, or does not apply to my work. While some of our attendees are completing this might be a good time to answer another question. An anonymous attendee asks, please have Neil and Quentin address what role fear plays for each part of the interaction between law enforcement and the community.
What a question. It's such a great question. And Neil, I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I can tell you that I think it plays a great role. And fear is many times born of not having knowledge, not having a full scope of education. And so, and I don't use the word sides for a reason, because implicit in the use of that word sides is that there's a divide. So I use parties. So all parties involved, the law enforcement agencies and communities, must understand that there is a need to be educated. If you're educated, you will come to an understanding of, let me just fix this, please. I think I have lost you for a second. Do you still hear me?
We can still hear you. It looks like your screen had frozen, but while you're figuring that out, I am going to
let me just do this.
end the poll, and I am going to share the results. So from the question posed, have you had exposure to community relations training as part of any in-service training? It looks like 65% of those who answered said yes, where 31% said no, and 4% said that this question did not apply to the work they did.
Got it. That's a great poll. Thank you. Yeah, I think it froze up when the poll came up. So back to fear. So both parties have a fear, and that fear is, I think, what causes the divide. And it's a fear based on lack of knowledge. We don't understand each other. And that's why the recipe for reconciliation is so important. And if you take the poll down, I think my screen will unfreeze. That's why the recipe for reconciliation is so important, because it teaches us to learn and understand each other. And that when we then have that connectivity, we see that fear is dissipated. Neil, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I've got two, Quentin. I think number one, I think there's two avenues to look at fear. One is from the citizenry being served to police officers. You know, ours is if you haven't worked in law enforcement, ours is a very mystifying profession. A lot of people do not know why we do the things that we do. And so I think to go to your issue, removing fear in the potential interaction helps us and helps police officers to create that base of trust that you talked about earlier. The other avenue of fear that I think we need to pay attention to comes from the early work on community policing. And Robert Chujanowicz advocated that police departments have to pay attention to the fear that citizens feel from moving in an unsafe environment, because we know that if people are fearful, then they will take their eyes and ears off the street, they will coop up, they'll go to work and come home and close the drapes, and that's where they'll kind of look like we're looking right now in a coronavirus environment where we're staying inside. And that immediately takes eyes and ears off the street. That deprives us, the law enforcement, of valuable information that we need to solve crime. So I think you can look at that fear issue from both those perspectives. Education between citizens and police departments, I think, is essential. Paying attention to fear in the population is essential for cops to know, simply because if I know that that's a critical piece, then I go about my task of policing a little bit differently so that I can try to remove fear from the citizenry.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
Neil, you had a great story that you told me. Do we have enough time for that, Laura?
I think there's always time for a story from Neil, in my personal opinion.
Okay. You had a great story that you told me yesterday about circumstances when you were chief of police.
Yeah.
Could you tell the audience that?
Yeah, I'll relate that. As a young police chief, I inherited a city that was, we were kind of awash in crack cocaine at the time. My predecessor had not held any sort of hard drug enforcement initiatives for 18 months prior to my appointment. So we knew, if you were a street cop, you knew that, especially in the African-American community, that you would not want your children walking in many of those areas because of the drug traffic was so rampant. So anyway, I'd had a bad experience on within my first year of a saturation patrol. And we took a lot of dope and guns off of the street, but at about the second week of the operation, I was getting very negative letters to the editor back before social media, which tells you how old I am. And so about 3-4 years into my tenure, we had a similar event happen. And I decided that we would take a different approach. By then, we're deep into community policing. In the first year, I was not. By the third, fourth year, we're into it. And it was going to be a 5-phase initiative. And the first phase was surveillance. And so we were taking photographs and video and trying to identify the area that we were going to attack in this drug issue. And we were trying to identify crack houses and hazards in the neighborhood and the folks that were dealing drugs by face and name if we could. And we were spending a lot of time. And so one day I walked into the head of narcotics and I said, "Is the map done, the surveillance map?" And he confirmed that it was. And so I went to the table, he showed, he was very proud of it. And I went to the table and I started rolling the map up. And he said, "Boss, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, there's a neighborhood association that I'm going to take this map to, and they're going to help us make the map better." Now, as an old cop, and every time I tell this story, Quentin, every old narcotics head that I talked to said, "You lost your mind."
That's what they told me when I entitled my book, Not to Get Killed by the Police. So I know where you are on that.
So my head of narcotics said, "Boss, you've lost your mind. You're going to let the bad guys know we're coming." And so I reminded him that the goal, or the end goal, was to remove the street side narcotics out of that community. And I took the map and I took markers with me and I rolled it out at the neighborhood association meeting and I said, "Help us. Show us other crack houses that we've missed. And if you know any other crack dealers, and especially if you know them by name, please give us the names and so that we can we want to do some warrant sweeps prior to putting our undercover teams in." And you know, Quentin, the group took the markers. They identified about 3 or 4 more houses that we didn't know about. They added a half dozen names of the knuckleheads that were selling the dope. And 2 or 3 of them had warrants on them. And I rolled the map back up, took it back to narcotics. But before I left the citizens, I said, "I'm going to be back every 2 weeks to brief you on where we are and how far we've come." And so I took the map back and I showed it to the narcotics commander. And I said, "Look," I said, "the citizens have identified more places that we missed." I said, "So let's make sure that we're putting energy into those as well as the others." And so we ran the operation for about 6 to 7 weeks. And when it was all done, we'd taken more dope and guns out of that community than ever before without the single complaint. And I was good to my word and had briefed the citizens every 2 weeks in that operation. And it became just our model way of doing things from that point forward.
And that didn't just happen overnight, where you could walk into a meeting like that, roll out a map, and say, tell us where everything is." That happened because you had built, through vulnerability, courage, purpose, power, pain. My guess, you built something. You built trust. And so when you walked into the room, they trusted you. They didn't turn their backs on you. And that's the benefit of doing this the right way. It's a long game. We have to get used to the long game. And what you did was through working day in and day out with the community and building that relationship and building trust, you were able to then, when you needed to, you had enough deposits in the bank to make a withdrawal when the time came, and they helped you out and they helped themselves out.
Yes.
And that's the key. Did you get much pushback when you did this from the community? Because I mean, in some communities, they would consider, if they gave you information, they would consider it a danger for their families. So how did you handle that?
I think the setting is what protected them, because they had this neighborhood association meeting once a month. And it was not uncommon at that point for me to occasionally pop into their meeting. So it looked relatively routine. And then even when I came back for the briefings, and we were able to, the only people that knew that the citizens had helped us were the narcotics team. And I thought that was critical as well, to protect the citizens. And they did. They responded so well. Now we did a couple of other things too, Quentin. The teams that did our saturation patrol, we did, before we turned them loose in the affected community, we revisited what's probable cause, what's reasonable suspicion. We told them, we knew from prior experience, they would stop a lot of law-abiding citizens in that community. And we told them, if you confirm that you're stopping a law-abiding citizen, then tell them what you're doing, why we're here. And then apologize. If you've been rough or terse, apologize. And so I think those reminders I was extremely proud of the way our officers reacted in that, and I was very proud of the way the citizens reacted.
Yeah, it's a great story. It highlights exactly why we are proponents of this long game action plan. And I appreciate that you shared that with me and you shared it with the audience. Thank you. So Laura, that's, I wanted to make this a condensed version of what ordinarily I would present so that we would be on schedule. If there are no other questions, if you have any questions or any other thoughts, that'd be fine. But just to recap and just to also let the audience know, the PowerPoint presentation has 2 or 3 pages. That'll have in it the recipe for reconciliation, which is listening, learning, understanding, acknowledging, taking action, building trust, getting the healing, and then getting to reconciliation. It has that, and then you'll see a diagram that my very incredible right-hand person, Laura Holden, was able to put together. It's of a house, and the 5 pillars that we talked about, the action pillars, vulnerability, courage, purpose, power, pain, those are the 5 pillars of the house that hold up this house of action. The house of action is founded in a foundation of open-mindedness. So you come to the party being open-minded, that you're going to be educated, you're going to listen, you're going to learn. And on that foundation lies those 5 pillars. Again, vulnerability, courage, purpose, power, pain. And then the roof is made up of all of the programs that we ordinarily associate with community relations. So we do have to have that roof, because those are the tools for us to express our vulnerability, courage, purpose, power, pain many times. But they're not the only ways to express it. Day to day, just interacting with people at the supermarket, you can do it. You don't have to have a formal tool in order to get in front of your community, obviously. And that house of action is what brings us to trust, healing, and reconciliation. So as you look at the recipe for reconciliation, when you get to the step that has action, the house is that action.
Great symbolism there.
Yes, yes.
Are there any other questions, Laura?
Not at this time. So I'm going to share with the audience some information.
Okay.
Let's just pull this up right here. So thank you to everyone for joining our webinar today. A special thank you to Dr. Neil Moore, our Director of Curriculum and Instruction with FBI-LEEDA, and a special thank you to our presenter, Quentin Williams, founder and CEO of Dedication to Community. Now, for more information, you can go to FBI-LEEDA.org and learn more about our upcoming webinars. And this webinar has been recorded and will be posted there. For more information about the work that Quentin and his team is doing, please feel free to visit Dedication to Community. Our next webinar will take place next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and our guest will be Todd LeDuc, Chief Strategy Officer with LifeScan Wellness Centers. He and Dr. Neil Moore will be discussing health issues facing first responders during the coronavirus. All of our attendees today will be receiving a recording of this webinar, a certificate of participation, and also the short PowerPoint that Quentin Williams was discussing. If you have any other questions, concerns, or would like to provide feedback about our webinars, please contact us at info@fbi-leeda.org.
Thank you, Laura.
Of course.
Okay.
And again, dedication to, that's tocommunity.org. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. We're all over social media. Please feel free to follow us, and you can follow me at Quentin Williams. And I'm on all of those platforms as well. I really appreciate this opportunity, Neil. That you are a treasure. Thank you for this conversation. Laura Seiler, again, a treasure. Thank you for everything you're doing. This was a joy.
Okay. Well, personally and on behalf of FBI-LEEDA, Quentin, we want to thank you and continued success in your work. You've got a very strong message.
Thank you. God bless you.
And to you.